My presentation is on the many paranormal experiences of Jennings Frederick. How many here just offhand know the Veggie Man story? Okay. I'm sure a lot of you guys know then about Jennings Frederick being the man that saw Veggie Man back in July '68. However, it's not the start of his experiences. He has had experiences starting all the way back into the early '60s, and they continued on for the rest of his life as far as we can tell. The very first encounter that he had actually was not his own. It actually involved his mother, Iva Fredericks, who on April 23rd, 1965, was doing basically the early morning tasks of the day. When she happened to look outside of her window, Jennings had gone to school, her husband had gone to go work in the coal mines. And as she looks outside this window, she sees a figure which she originally thought was a child playing, and became worried because there were some barbed wire fences and electric fences nearby. So she goes out onto the porch to get a better look and potentially wrangle this child if need be. And as she's out there, she realizes that this isn't a kid. There she sees a 3.5 to 4 foot tall creature that to her bore a resemblance to a devil. It had a long tail, it had pointed ears or horns, spiky feet, and interestingly enough, not nestled relatively close to it, there was a silver cream-colored UFO with a crystal canopy and a type of shaft that extended down from it, from which you could see basically what looked like ladder rungs. And coming from this UFO and connecting to the creature was a type of cord. She watched this creature for some time as it was holding basically a bag and taking clumps of dirt out of the field and putting them into this bag. But as time got on, this proved to be way too much for her, and she ran back inside and hopped into bed and remained there until eventually she heard and could see the creature run back to the craft and then fly off. She remained there until Jennings finally came home, and Jennings, it is made abundantly clear, has an interest in the UFO phenomenon at this time. And so his mother, who is telling him this story, decides to go out and investigate the field and search for any evidence of this craft or the occupant. Whereupon he actually finds a series of footprints and a depression into the ground. He ends up using plaster of Paris and making casts of these depressions and footprints, and manages to find some hair samples in between where the toes are. And also that, curiously enough, this creature seemed to have been wearing some sort of suit, as the footprint is separated by almost like a strip. After removing the plaster cast, he decides to go and inform and send these basically casts and sorry, I lost my train of thought there. The casts and the UFO landing area and send it to the Air Force for testing. Whereupon the Air Force basically said that his mother had seen either a planet or had a wild case of imagination, as well as some other not so kind words. And also they refused to give back the casts that Jennings had sent them. Now, nothing would seemingly happen for some time. However, these are the original summary of experiences that both Jennings and his mother had. They are dated as well as signed, so essentially guaranteeing that when these reports came out that they were trying to tell the truth as best they can. These were collected then and sent later by Jennings to Gray Barker sometime later. Shortly thereafter, in June of 1967, Jennings had just graduated high school when around 3 in the morning, he suddenly awoke and was heading out the door in his underwear. This is in, I don't know, as you often do. The reason for this is that he appeared to have been in a kind of almost trance-like state. He almost describes it as being asleep, but not entirely. He works his way out to a particular field about a quarter of a mile away from his house, whereupon he suddenly wakes up and sees this large object come down and land right around where he's at. From this object, he hears a voice, basically telling him a variety of different things that they need. They are tired, seeking peace, that they're keeping an eye on us, and that they would communicate again. Jennings, depending on which version of the account you read, either runs away before hearing this message or directly after it. However, that would be all that he would seemingly remember, is just seeing this craft, hearing this voice, and that was it. Until in 1976, he would basically have a full remembrance of the events that occurred. He was with a friend, and all this suddenly came to him. And in a letter to Gray Barker, he basically felt very terrified by this, as there was a strong indication to him that these beings were hostile. The thing about this is that he remembers floating through the bottom of the ship, and encountering a being which he would refer to as Zarkon. Zarkon, it was described as having this colossally large head, pointed ears, these wraparound eyes. He allegedly wore a type of robe, and he appeared to Jennings to be 7 to 10 feet tall. However, Jennings could not gauge an actual size on this, because he would often say that Zarkon would seem to fluctuate in size on the ship. He would also say that the creature was apparently at one point totally disappear its lower body, and its head would then grow to the size of a washing machine and float in midair as it communicated with him. But whenever the body was visible, it seemed to have hovered some 2 feet off the ground. The being would basically explain that to Jennings, that it was not physical in the same sense as we would consider physical. Jennings, of course, would state that he didn't believe him, and at one point, this being actually removed a section of the ship and showed him whether this being some sort of screen or whether this being a window of some sort, his home, which was right below where this object was. This being would also state the typical UFO messages, stating that essentially that we could not understand their means of propulsion. He also would they'd give us a location from around where they claimed to be, which they said was the sector of Triangus Terrae Ellipsen. Essentially, this being then would deposit Jennings back on Earth, and that was the end of that experience. Jennings would write about this a couple times in letters with Ray Barker, as well as UFO Focus #2 and True UFO magazine. Now, the most famous case that Jennings has become interconnected with, and chronologically, from what we can tell, is his third, is the Veggie Man case. This occurred mid-July '68. Jennings was on his family's property, bow hunting for groundhogs, and decided that at one point to rest near a maple tree, whereupon he heard this high-pitched, almost like a record being spun at a very high rate of speed. And it's from this that he stated that he could make out words. And the words that he heard were, "You need not fear me. I wish to communicate. I come as a friend. We know of you all. I come in peace. I wish medical assistance. I need your help." It was then that Jennings had actually decided that he reached down for a pocket handkerchief because he was slightly sweating, be it from the hot day or just from the messages in general. It's not exactly stated. Whereupon he felt the hand of a creature gripping him. At first he didn't realize that it was a hand. He thought that he was actually stuck in a briar brush. But upon looking down, he noticed that he was in the clutches of this creature. And as he worked his way up, he noted that it was about 7 feet tall, bright green in color, 2 to 3 inches thick at the torso, and also that the creature had these incredibly long fingers that were about 7 inches in length, and that they ended in tiny suction cups. The creature also had arms as thick as a quarter. These were very specific details, and they were often. And Jennings made several sketches of the creature that he would send to Barker. This was one of the primary ones, not the one that he used in the newsletter, but one of the ones that he originally sent to him, attached to the original report. Now, as Jennings could feel this creature's grip and the pain that it caused, suddenly he noticed a strange thing with the creature's eyes. The creature's eyes, which were bright, vibrant yellow, suddenly began to get these swirls of red in them, almost as though the blood was being drawn from him into the eyes, and that inside of these swirls there was these tiny pinpricks of orange, almost as where they would meet. And when this was going on, Jennings would not feel the pain. This went on for not exactly a long period of time, but enough, when suddenly the creature let go and then began to bound away. In the original report that Barker wrote then for the newsletter that the creature was made famous by here, that he described it as a spring-heeled jack leaping type motion. And that basically this creature was able to do this in such a quick duration, 10 seconds flat, as well as being able to clear high fences as it went over the hill. Now, an interesting thing about this is that the original letters that were exchanged between Barker and Jennings state that the Veggie Man did not bound off into the forest as Barker would write, but that the creature actually dematerialized before his eyes, almost phasing out, if you will. And then a short time after that it happened, he then heard this buzzing, humming sound, which he would compare to the sound of a vacuum. Essentially, he would hear this even though there was no object sighted. So not exactly a direct UFO connection, however, he felt that it was such. He eventually decided to go and return home, but opted against telling his family about this. His mother being very religious, and with a previous experience of the space devil, it sort of became problematic to talk about this colossal creature. Jennings would actually experience, however, pain in his arm for some time, and Jennings also had a heart condition during this time. In later discussions of the case between him and Barker, it would be stated that he could only sleep on basically his arm to help with the heart condition. However, with this arm, after the incident, it proved difficult to do this. He also would state that 2 weeks after his sighting, he would experience nightmares of this creature, which he would later attribute to shock. Something that's interesting and something that needs to be brought up is oftentimes people believe that this is a one-off event. Jennings would have dreams later on about this creature, on and off. However, he's not the only one to see something similar to this. In Texas in the 70s, according to Albert Rosales' works, The Humanoid Encounters, there is a report of a tall, 7-foot-tall creature bounding across a football field. Further details are scant, but it matches the overall description. In Puerto Rico, during the Chupacabra flap in the 90s, there is a report of a trash can-shaped UFO object on the ground, and 2 children approaching this object were suddenly grabbed by a green, 3-fingered hand that just like in the Jennings Frederick case, grabbed them by the wrist and seemed to be attempting to withdraw blood. The creature in this case, however, was not 7 feet tall. It was a mere 3 feet tall. However, the witnesses described it in a similar body description as the Veggie Man, in regards to it being almost shaped more corn-like than vegetable-like. There have also been comparisons to some of the UFO fairy-type entities that have been related. A very similar-looking entity, also clad in green and having the ridiculous hooked-type nose, is the Mjarvi elf, recorded in the 70s in Finland. However, there is also significant differences in that case, and more of its own. However, there is intriguing features in both. Also, in regards to nightmare-oriented relations with the Veggie Man, there was a report around the same time in the 70s of a woman that claimed to have seen the hair and the grin that appeared out of a burning hole in her floor, and and the creature appeared to also be wearing a black robe. Jennings Frederick, later, after his sighting of the Vegetable Man, would enter the Air Force, whereupon he would serve for some time, and later would claim to work for both NASA and the Air Force in general, whereupon he allegedly had caught sight of a secret program, which to Barker he originally had stated he was not quite sure what was going on there, but he knew that many prominent people would be, as he quoted, sacked. In regards to it. Later on, he would elaborate on this, claiming that he had actually seen construction of UFOs, as well as that the objects would match or have something in relation to the project of the Avro saucer car, which that was an early Canadian and U.S. attempt to create a type of vehicle to help aid in military conquest. Jennings would also write a few different articles on the creation of these craft, as well as a few other concepts such as ancient aliens. Okay, Men in Black. So about 4 months after his experiences in the military and being discharged, he would wake one night by a bright red light that seemed to be coming from outside of his farmhouse. He was living at home at the time. He was sleeping on a cot, and his brother was sleeping in the bedroom in the living room. And as he noticed this bright red light, he originally thought that it was the furnace catching on fire. This proved not to be the case, however, as suddenly the home was flooded with a type of gas. And as he basically was trying to realize this, he reached under his pillow for a weapon, only to eventually be stopped by several men that were coming from the window. These figures were dressed in ski masks, turtlenecks, and black pants of similar nature. The figures basically would talk amongst themselves and inject Jennings with a type of needle into his arm. The figures would say about how they had darted the dogs and the entire house had been gassed so that nobody could get up. The beings then, or the men, depending on your interpretation, then decided to go and put a gas mask over Jennings' face and begin to ask him questions about the UFO field, as well as different questions about time, space, what he thought the UFOs were. In a letter that he wrote, he basically had said that he had put up a mental block to avoid answering their questions, as he felt that his UFO research was secretive as well. The following morning, Jennings would basically ask his parents about this memory and see if they had any recollection, which they did not. And for a while, it would seem that the men in black had gone away. However, this was not to be the case. Eventually, in the 70s, throughout the 70s, him and a coworker named Larney D. Fry would experience several different incidents with the men in black, many of which would seem to be a bend of these people or government agents or entities attempting to actually harm the two men. During this time, they also had seen a blue conical shaped or cigar shaped type object in the sky that lit up. And Jennings during this time was also claiming to do different research into rockets and rocket propulsion, as well as conducting UFO research at the time. These are some summaries of the experiences of the Men in Black, and one signed by Larney Fry, and basically discussing some of the incidents where the cars had been allegedly sabotaged, which could have led to. So in '75, Jennings would actually reach out to Ray Barker, and this is how we get a lot of these informations and accounts. He essentially was trying to get a hold of Barker originally because he had an interest in John Keel's research into the Mothman. He was interested in talking to see what he knew about it, talking to Keel, as well as the fact that he had already spoken to Linda Scarberry at the time. The interesting thing about this is that it basically was sort of a back and forth. The Veggie Man story was sort of a way to get Barker talking to him, and then it turned into the whole cavalcade of other cases and incidents, as well as the Space Devil stuff and the Men in Black. Jennings also would describe several other instances in his life during these correspondences, many of which we unfortunately do not have a lot of information on. One such example is a report of a hairy type creature which is very similar to the 1973 Bigfoots that were reported in the Westmoreland County flap. These creatures were not like your typical Bigfoot. They had pointed ears and fangs and almost a dog-like snout in a lot of the pictures. They also left three-toed tracks, which, while slightly common, were not entirely as famous or well-known as the five-toed tracks. Jennings would also claim to have experienced entities that were similar to Zarkon, but of a smaller scale, and he would also state that these beings were much more peaceful than Zarkon. On top of all this, Jennings would also frequently have experiences of these dreamlike instances where he would be seemingly either viewing another planet or having just fanciful visions of UFOs being constructed in flower-strewn fields. Unfortunately, again, not much is known about these, since a lot of the times they appear just as blurbs in between Jennings' correspondences. So here again, here's some more of the Jennings correspondences from the original couple. Jennings is a UFO investigator. So Jennings, during this period of time in the 70s, after all of his major sightings, he started looking into a lot of the UFO stuff that was in the Rivesville, Fairmont, Morgantown area. Most notably would be the Dominic Fan incidents, where he saw basically a UFO that seemed to change shape and have several appendages that would alternate and change as it moved throughout the sky. There were about 20 photographs taken by Fan of this object that made it into the papers. Unfortunately, most of them seemingly just appear as big white blobs that are indistinguishable from anything. There's no way to gauge size or anything along those lines. At one point, Jennings also reported seeing a UFO that was about the size of a tin can that was flying through the area as well. There have been several instances of Jennings Xeroxing files to Barker and just corresponding about different lectures that Jennings was taking at the time and conducting as well on the subject. Jennings also managed to allegedly get a hold of what is referred to as angel hair or space grass. This typically is described as a wiry type substance that is usually found in areas around UFO landings and sites. Unfortunately, again, there's not much else that's known. Okay. In 1977, Jennings had attempted to start working on a book. This book was going to catalog all of his experiences in one volume, and he had at one point sent Barker a copy or a version of the cover that he was intending on doing himself, from which it depicted his most famous subjects. So you have the hairy Bigfoot-like creature, you have the Men in Black type figures, you have the Zarkon ships, there's also the Space Devil and Veggie Man as well. A lot of the time, however, this book did not come to fruition, and so a lot of what Jennings experienced can only be gleaned through these letters and secondary sources. There even was at one point in UFO Review a cassette tape that allegedly had Jennings speaking on it about all of his experiences. These experiences would also include this hairy creature that he reported, and as well as his Men in Black experiences, his Zarkon abduction, and Veggie Man, of course. However, where these cassettes are right now is a mystery, it appears, as searching online and through different archives have proven to be unable to find any. Most people that stumble across the Jennings Frederick case really can be pointed to a variety of books. Brad Steger, for example, in his book Alien Meetings, covered the case, and it was very much inspired by the Gray Barker newsletter, as it covered the original three main cases that appeared in that, with the Men in Black, the Veggie Man, and also the Space Devil. The original Eyewitness Sketch also makes appearance into the Unknown book series that was published at the time in the UFO phenomenon. However, further details exactly on that case were not exactly presented. It was more listed as an illustration showing the different types of aliens or beings reported. Another famous one that needs to be shouted out, of course, was the American Monsters website, which had the original Vegetable Man artwork that has become very famous as it's viewed now, which is the famous big-eared, more spindly type creature that's almost insectoid in appearance. Okay. And then we have the variety of different sources that have the Jennings Frederick story involved. And Mike Strayer also has written a children's book about the subject. And there we go. All right, thank you so much for everything, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you for hearing me speak. I hope I didn't do it too poorly. This is my second real full discussion on the subject. Does anybody have any questions or anything?
Would you care to comment on the connection between Jennings Frederick and John Keel?
Well, there is a famous letter written by Barker to Keel about how Invasion of the Saucermen very much is probably the inspiration of the story for Veggie Man. And the idea is that'll be the upcoming movie, I believe, next. If you look at the rotating eyes of the Veggie Man, they are very similar to the Invasion of the Saucermen type figures, as well as just the overall look of Zarkon. However, in regards to Veggie Man, in the film, there is this aspect of the aliens utilizing their fingernails to basically inject people with alcohol to make them unreliable. This is very similar to what is described as with the Veggie Man story. There's a few other things that are noteworthy as well with that, because there is indication that Jennings had wrote to Keel. I have not found anything there. There's also indication that he wrote to Jerome Clark, and indication that he wrote to Jim Mosley. But again, I haven't found any of those letters myself. Another aspect that I thought about and noticed too is that there is a strong resemblance to the Veggie Man story, and actually an episode of Lost in Space.
The one with the carrot.
Yes, particularly Dr. Smith in that episode. When he turns into, for those that are not familiar with the episode, there is basically the crew land on this planet that has sentient plants. And the leader of this is a large carrot named, I believe, Tybal. Don't quote me, it's been a bit. But basically this entity hates humans and other organisms that are not plants, because any action that you do to a plant is considered harming it or killing it in some variety. And so this entity basically, whenever a human or something like that landed on it, they would turn that person into a plant. Now, in the episode, Dr. Smith is one of the few that actually slowly becomes plantified. And his figure is very similar. In the Veggie Man sketch, I'll actually bring back up. If I can get this mouse to work, there we go. In the Veggie Man sketch, he has this crazy lumpy type hair type figure or feature. And that is very similar to like the stalks that are growing out of Dr. Smith's head in the episode. Dr. Smith was also bright, vibrant green, just like that. Dr. Smith also had a very large nose. So there's a lot of similarities in just how he appeared in that episode and how Veggie Man is appearance. Also, the sci-fi of the times featured a lot of things that you could point to. The Thing from Another World is another one, where you're describing how the thing was described as, at one point, as a living carrot, and that it was a plant-like organism. There is this also fact that in The Thing from Another World, this creature drank blood, or utilized blood. There's a scene that's shot off camera where the dogs are supposed to be hanging over top of like the botanical area, and that the blood is supposed to like drip down onto the plants that they had on the site. again, a connection there. Another thing that can be pointed to also in regards to the eyes in particular is the Adam West Batman series from the 60s. In that, there's the villain, the Mad Hatter, for those familiar with that. And the gimmick of the Mad Hatter is mind control. One of his utilized weapons or technology is basically a hat that he wears on top of his head that actually shoot out a pair of eyes that are very similar to what is depicted in the Jennings Frederick Veggie Man sketch, and that they utilize these eyes to basically control people, and they shoot out a yellow-orange beam. So there is the chance that the Veggie Man story is entirely based on these works of fiction and the aspects along those times. When the editor of UFO Focus, when he heard the Zarkon story, even he kind of felt that Jennings was, from his perspective, was telling the truth, but maybe not. It could have been one of John Keel's, what he refers to, celestial hoaxes. However, there's, again, the whole aspect that later on he became a UFO researcher that actually did document cases. So is it like that he could also have been attempting to gain recognition by having his own experiences? Again, this is only something that we can speculate, but it's things that we do have to point out when looking at his case. The Space Devil sighting, again, as well as the incidents with Marnie D. Fry, you have written signatures from the mother as well as Jennings and Marnie D. Fry, basically stating that they have had these experiences, so it's more than just one person stating such. So that's also something to keep in mind too. But in regards to particularly if this case is inspired by science fiction, it's a possibility and something that we have to keep in check, and something to keep in mind as well. So, yes.
After the late 60s and 70s, it seems like maybe he was less active. What did he do for the rest of his life? From the late 70s onward?
Unfortunately, it's not well known. We know that he has a family. I have attempted to actually reach out to the family a couple times just to get more insight into him as a person. Because originally that was one of the big aspects, is I wanted to know more about him as a person and know more about his story. Because after the late 70s into the early 80s, he basically dropped off the face of the map. Whether this was because of Gray Barker's sudden death, or whether this was because of some personal things, such as the fact that he did have family members, like he had children, whether it had to be parenting with them, it's not very well known. We do know that he has passed. He is buried up at Grafton National Cemetery. However, as to what happened to him after these experiences, we really don't know. He just sort of dropped off the face of the map. There's nothing past the late 70s in regards to communications, at least that can be found.
What year did he first tell the story to Gray Barker?
He originally sent letters to Gray Barker in December of 75 and January of 76. This gave Barker enough time for when the March newsletter came out, which is where the story came out of, gave him enough time to actually go down and interview him and get the full story, as well as receive some of the other documents from him.
Yeah.
So that's the first official physical report from him.
Okay, and that was after the Mothman Prophecies came out?
Yes, actually, that's part of the reason why he got a hold of Barker in the first place, is because he had this understanding that Keel and Barker were, he would refer to them as either knowing each other or friends type of a deal, that he wanted to get more information actually on Mothman from Barker, as well as his ideas on Keel. And was reading Mothman Prophecies throughout these early letters. So That's something too that could have been inspired. There was a theory at one point that Barker completely fabricated this entire story as a way of capitalizing on the Mothman. Like Barker, basically Keel had Mothman, and so they wanted this. So there was this theory at one point that Barker created the Veggie Man as his answer to that. However, which was part of the reason when I was first looking into the case, I wanted to see if Jennings Frederick was a real person and if I could track down things like that, which I was able to do then later on, unfortunately, by finding his obituary. But that was one of the early theories, was this idea that Jennings Frederick was basically just one of Barker's creative writing prompts. However, it proved not to be. Yes?
Yeah, you talked about Lost in Space. Which came first, Jennings' story or the Lost in Space episodes and all the other science fiction?
Okay. So technically, most of the reports, but if you go off of Jennings claiming to see this sighting in the 60s, Thing from Another World came out in the 50s. Batman came out in 66. Lost in Space came out, I want to say that came out, yeah. So he had the chance to actually view this media and utilize it in creating the story. There's obviously things too where how available. We know that Jennings lived on an old farmhouse that was about 2 miles outside of Rivesville, and that it was a 40-acre farmhouse. And the question is how much technology was he had access to at that time? It's not out of the realm of possibility for him to have seen, gone to the movies at a young age, or seen Thing from Another World, or but the chance of him seeing Lost in Space when it came out straight onto his television. So it's one of those things where we don't know and have to also think about if he even had access to that kind of television. Again, it's something where there's a lot of things about the Jennings story and Jennings Frederick just in general as a person that we just don't know because there's not much about him. Digging through Ancestry.com, we can find that he was born in 1949. And we have pictures of his family. We know, digging through yearbooks, that at one point he was the treasurer at the Rivesville High School. But a lot of the further details about his life have not really been brought to public attention. And part of that, obviously, is the fact that he probably wanted a little bit of privacy to some extent. Again, I've attempted to reach out to the family to get an idea a little bit more up into his life, but unfortunately that hasn't come to fruition at all. But it is possible that he could have seen different science fiction films or shows, and that just helped him to narrate or create the stories that he had.
I saw a correspondence between John Keel and Gray Barker. If you remember, John Keel often went to West Virginia reporter Mary Heyer in order to see what the scoop of the local monsters were in West Virginia and all the UFO sightings and stuff like that. But she died in 1970. Afterwards, he messaged Gray Barker, seeing if Gray Barker would help him out, see what kind of was going on at the time in West Virginia, because he was out in New York, and he mentioned the Veggie Man thing. He said that Barker had told him about the Veggie Man, and they discussed this idea that it could be some kind of screen memory or something implanted memory in Frederick's mind, because it's about taking his blood, and the Men in Black also took his blood. So he was discussing the idea that it was some kind of memory implanted in his mind. Some absurd tale to make him look silly that he wouldn't think about, that he wouldn't tell anyone about, the idea of that.
That's also a possibility. There's a bunch of times when you're looking back at contactees and abductees in the 70s and 80s and 50s and 60s, where a lot of the times there is this idea of a screen memory. A famous case that is from California, the space brains of Palos Verdes, involves such a memory of this man basically encountered giant schloppies, brains in the middle of the road, and that during his abduction, it appeared that everything behind him wasn't there, and that he was just being shown like a screen and things like that. And of course, there's also the prophetic aspects of that too, where the beings told him things and they didn't come to fruition. So there's different aspects to that that also could be in a case like this. But again, it's one of those things where we're really probably not ever going to get a definitive answer to it.
When I was listening to the Moth Boys episode in this, they brought up a theory about maybe this being the flatwoods monster out of its armor. I didn't know if you had any. I thought it was an interesting.
That is interesting. I know with the Flatwoods case, there have been other sightings. There was obviously the Franktown incident is one of them, which occurred a day after the Flatwoods incident, and then there was a report from Strange Creek of a creature that basically matched the description of the Flatwoods monster in regards to body type, but it appeared to be missing like the Ace of Spades shaped head. And it also matches the fact that allegedly a UFO crashed there too. The Franktown incident, though, is the more famous one where people reported seeing like a reptilian type figure inside of a mechanical floating, the Flatwoods monster sort of trash can type deal. And it too had, that's an interesting one because if you go off that, the creature reported in that case had biforked fingers, which you would imagine almost like a T-Rex type deal when it touched the roof of the individual's car. Veggie Man has more fingers and things like that. And also, Jennings would describe it more as being fleshy as opposed to scaly. I mean, it's possible with things like that. With cases like these, we're never really going to come to a definitive answer to it unless we find like a diary that says, I totally made this up. Or, you know, we have a secondary person that comes forward and says, no, he made it up and here's the evidence, the proof's in the pudding type of a deal. So we can think about different cases and things like that that could potentially be related. Like I brought up the Injarvi Elf case, which really, upon looking at that case, you have similarities in like the facial structure and like the fact that it wore green, but it also had like a dunce cap and also seemed to hold a camera, something that we don't see in the Jennings Frederick case. So the more usage of technology. But